Hello everybody, Jacob from Bryn Mawr Film Institute here. Our film this week is A Streetcar Named Desire from 1951, directed by Elia Kazan. To learn more about this and other film studies opportunities, please visit us online at brynmarfilm.org. So even if you haven't seen A Streetcar Named Desire, you've almost certainly felt its impact. This film features an incredibly influential, star-making performance by Marlon Brando. It's also the source of numerous iconic lines and scenes, and it helped usher in an era of more mature Hollywood movies. The story itself is a kind of Southern Gothic melodrama, following Blanche DuBois, a woman from an old-money Mississippi family that has fallen in its fortunes. And this brings Blanche to working-class New Orleans, where she comes to stay with her sister, Stella, and her boorish brother-in-law, Stanley. The film is based on the play by Tennessee Williams, and it was Kazan himself who directed that play's original Broadway production, which debuted in late 1947. Now, Kazan had built his career as an actor and a stage director. By 47, he'd already started doing some work in Hollywood, but he was still very much involved in the theater world. Among his accomplishments in that sphere was that he'd helped found the Actors Studio, which would become the leading training center for method acting in the United States during that period. And most of the leads in his production of Streetcar came out of that workshop. So that included Kim Hunter, who played Stella, Carl Malden, who played Mitch, and most famously Marlon Brando as Stanley Kowalski. The part of Blanche DuBois was played by Jessica Tandy, and unlike those others, Tandy came from a background of classical training, and she'd made her name doing Shakespeare on the British stage. And so the juxtaposition of those acting styles, that is, Tandy's theatrical classical style, up against Brando's more raw method approach, that juxtaposition was deliberate, and the contrast underscored the conflict between their characters. So Streetcar became a big success on stage, and Warner Brothers moved quickly to begin a film adaptation. However, Kazan was initially not interested in directing the film version, and it was only at the behest of Tennessee Williams that he finally agreed to do it. Kazan's main reservation about the project was effectively that he didn't want to just replicate what they'd done on stage. And so he started envisioning an adaptation that would open up the story. So in contrast to the play, which takes place mostly in Stella and Stanley's apartment, this opened-up version would feature scenes of the DuBois family home and of Blanche's life before she comes to stay with her sister, and it would have painted a more expansive picture of New Orleans in the 1940s. But as Kazan worked on this treatment, it became clear to him that this approach just wasn't working, and he realized that the limited location was key to the effectiveness of the story. And so ultimately they went into production with a script quite similar to Williams's original stage play. What's more, Kazan actually doubled down on the play's sense of confinement in the film version. For example, the set of Stella and Stanley's apartment was constructed such that the walls could be slid inwards, and as the film goes on, you might notice that the physical space gets smaller and smaller and smaller. The cast stayed mostly the same. Brando, Hunter, and Malden all reprised their roles, but Jessica Tandy was replaced by another classically trained British actress, this being Vivien Leigh, who'd previously played Blanche in a UK production of the play. Now, during this period, Hollywood films were still subject to censorship along pretty strict moral guidelines. And given Streetcar's intensity and its provocative themes, it was inevitable that they would run into some trouble, and they did. The main objections came from a group called the Catholic Legion of Decency, who threatened to label the film indecent. And the common wisdom at this time was that such a label would effectively doom a film's commercial prospects. And so after some fairly heated negotiations, a few changes were indeed made to meet the Legion's standards. This both in terms of what was filmed and also what made it into the final cut. Most of these edits had to do with toning down or obscuring content related to sexuality, and there was also a slight change made to the film's ending. Now, I'm being a little oblique here because I don't want to spoil anything for those that haven't seen the film, but this is certainly something we can talk about in more detail during our discussion. I will note, though, that in 1993, a version of Streetcar was released that restored some of the material that had been excised. This is the version that runs about 2 hours and 5 minutes. So Streetcar came out in theaters in 1951, and like the play, it was a big hit. It was nominated for 12 Oscars, of which it won 4. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this introduction, this film was not just successful, it was influential. And so let's unpack that a little bit more. To start with, Streetcar was quite unusual for its time in terms of its sexual frankness. Now, that frankness goes beyond just acknowledging certain sexual acts. This is a film that gives serious consideration to the sexual habits and pathologies of its characters. And it makes these elements central to understanding who these people are and why they act in the ways that they do. And the fact that the film was so successful signaled that audiences were willing to engage with this kind of material. You know, this was a sign of changing tastes, and it was perhaps an early indicator of the censorship code's declining authority. And indeed, as the decade went on, Hollywood began to produce more films that dealt with mature themes. For example, Anatomy of a Murder, or Some Like It Hot, or Psycho, among others. Now, we've also got to talk about Marlon Brando. So Brando was not the first method actor to feature prominently in film, but the explosiveness and ferocity of his performance as Stanley, as well as his style of elocution. This was something that hadn't really been seen before. So the theatrical production of Streetcar had elevated Brando from, virtually unknown to a lauded stage actor. The film version turned him into a full-fledged movie star. And so Brando's work during the 1950s, starting with A Streetcar Named Desire, would prove to be incredibly influential on Hollywood acting. And many of the great actors of the next generation and beyond owe him a debt. Now, in addition to making Brando a star, Streetcar also turned him into a sex symbol. It is significant within the plot that Stanley is physically attractive, but this is a version of male beauty that hadn't really been depicted on screen in a major way before. So most earlier leading men, like Cary Grant or Clark Gable, for example, usually projected a kind of dapper elegance. Occasionally you might see somebody like Humphrey Bogart looking grubby, but that look wasn't generally aestheticized in those instances. In Streetcar, though, we see Brando in sweat-stained clothing or covered in grease and motor oil, and the camera shoots him admiringly. The wardrobe was significant as well, particularly the t-shirt. So, wearing a t-shirt as an outer garment had only started to become commonplace really during the post-war period, and dressing Brando in one in Streetcar was a fairly bold move. This was a recognition of a new style that was developing in the 1950s, and the film certainly helped turn that into an iconic look. I want to conclude by touching on Streetcar as a kind of regional work. So this is a classic Southern story, not just because it happens to be set in Louisiana, but because it takes up some of the dynamics of Southern identity during that era. In Blanche and Stanley, we see a collision between two versions of the South. Blanche comes from an old South, which is in decline, and this version of the South is aristocratic. It's built on an agrarian plantation economy. It prizes ancestry and pedigree. It has a culture that's based on ritual and social decorum. Stanley, on the other hand, is representative of a rising New South, which is more urban, it's more industrial, and it's much more diverse, due in part to an influx of immigration. Now, there's also a class confrontation and a racial confrontation that gets braided into Stanley and Blanche's relationship as well. So this is a really rich film. There's plenty to talk about that I haven't even touched on in this introduction. I hope you'll join us at our discussion. I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts. Thanks a lot.